I'm Mark Stewart, and like many would-be public servants, I think about solutions. And you've seen many possible ones. So many of them come down to reducing federal government power. But how? Well, it's simple. Enforce the law. The supreme law of our land is the Constitution. No law should contradict it. No enforcement should be within the powers of, and no enforcement is proper unless it's within the powers of the federal Constitution. It means that oppressive governments that have been created should never have been created at all. Urban renewal grants, no. Higher education grants, not in the Constitution's power. Medicare, no. Obamacare, no. Almost every item of federal spending that we call earmarks, no. And notice how these prohibitions are also wise. It keeps spending where it should be, with us, or potentially with states. Here's another that should have never come about, not with a strict interpretation of our Constitution. It's the selective service. That means drafting young men to fight wars for the pleasure of elderly congressmen should not be allowed. No, not in a Constitution that was drafted, different use of draft, largely to preserve individual freedoms. So what is Congress allowed to do? I'll get to that. Please recognize what the Constitution is. In the name of protecting liberty while giving wise orders for governance, it's a supreme operating system. It can be altered, but that takes a clear operation in itself. That's the amendment process. The Constitution prescribes for federal power very tight constraints. The Constitution is a grant of power, a grant to the government from people. And people, Americans, retain all other rights. Our framers called them natural rights. So the powers granted are very limited. Congress is granted 18 specific powers. They're in Article 1, Section 8. Coining money, operating post offices, devising a system of weights and measures, providing a system of patents, calling forth the state militias, declaring war. There are some others. The Constitution grants the federal government these specific powers. The Constitution grants the federal government zero general powers. We know this from the limited nature of the grant, but it's also reinforced by the 9th Amendment and the 10th Amendments, reserving all powers not granted to the states or the people. So here comes 3 objections. Let me counter all of them. Number 1, the promote the general welfare clause. All right, it is part of the Constitution. It is not a grant of general legislative power, but it's a qualification on the taxing power that it should spend revenues on matters of general interest to the federal government only. As Hamilton put it, Madison, he asserted that spending must at least be tangentially related to one or the other specifically enumerated powers, the earlier ones that I mentioned, such as regulating foreign commerce, interstate commerce, or providing for the military. The General Welfare Clause, Madison said, is not a specific grant of power, but a statement of purpose qualifying that same power to tax. All right, there's also objection 2, the necessary and proper clause. Now, there are 2 reasonable interpretations of this. One was given by the Anti-Federalists. Here's the clause that made it against the Anti-Federalists' objections. Congress shall have the power to make all laws which shall be necessary and proper for carrying into execution the foregoing powers. Okay, foregoing meant the, again, granted enumerated specific powers. So, laws necessary and proper for their execution would still be the execution of laws that are very limited. And the Anti-Federalists said, this necessary and proper clause looks too dangerous. It shouldn't be in the first place. The Federalists, led by Hamilton, won the day. But Hamilton himself would say, actually he'd write it in the Federalist Papers, the clause would permit only execution of powers that had been granted by the Constitution. So the clause stayed in, Hamilton's faction won out, but this was an exact interpretation of limited powers, limiting even the necessary and proper clause. Ladies and gentlemen, there is no interpretation other than the possibility of limitless power, making the prior enumerated powers useless. And then there'd be no need to list great specific powers if Congress can do anything that it deems necessary. By the way, there'd also be no need for a constitutional convention. The delegates, they could have gone home with a document that then gave Congress more power than the king and parliament from which their young republic had recently separated. So finally, there is the Commerce Clause, and I'll let you assess it. There it is, if you lack video. The U.S. Congress shall have the power to regulate commerce with foreign nations and among the several states and with the Indian tribes. You, listeners, are about to use more logic than almost every congressman in the last century, and you're about to see more guts on display than almost every Supreme Court justice has exercised in the last 80 years. You just have read 3 items, conjoined in one clause, which means we treat them similarly, as in every Tom, Dick, and Harry, as in life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, to quote another monumental document. Congress could not possibly legislate in 2 of these 3 areas, okay? They weren't going to legislate individual businessmen in Paris, London, Copenhagen. Nor could Congress possibly attempt to regulate transactions in tribes where they hardly ever sent any formerly colonial settlers or state officials, okay? The Massasoit, the Shawnee, the Algonquin tribes were being left alone to do their own commerce. All right, so that's 2 out of 3. Now, 3 out of 3. Congress would not possibly regulate the transactions of farmers in Delaware and those in Maryland. The power of Congress is instead with dealing with officials of all 3 realms. So when the leaders of France as a nation should be dealt with, that would be Congress's prerogative. When the leaders of Indian tribes had commercial issues, that was Congress's prerogative, not the militaries, not the courts, not the presidents. So similarly, when states might come into conflict, it was Congress's domain to regulate the commercial agendas of those states in conflict. Congress, in effect, could break ties. Congress was not to legislate for the state's commerce. That means no federal farm programs, no federal OSHA requirements, no federal Social Security regimes. So what could Congress do? Probably in modern times, TSA, if there were a conflict between states about airport safety. Probably giving licenses on the radio spectrum, which is almost indivisible among 50 states. Now, note, even these are solved by states agreeing voluntarily to a uniform commercial code. We have that now, and some states with it make some minor exceptions where it might wreak havoc, that is the Universal Commercial Code. Congress here would be empowered to make final decisions and maybe decide on regulations. That's the limited power of Congress. So much other stuff is beyond the granted powers to Congress. And rolling them back, as we should be on almost everyone's agenda. Thanks for listening. Hope I've clarified. I'm Mark Stewart.